What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. Today I'll be going over my favorite wide receivers to trade for in week 2. I went over running backs yesterday and we talked about some general draft strategy as well, so make sure to check that out if you haven't done so already. But for today we have wide receivers, and the biggest thing we're looking at are air yards, targets, and where these targets come on the field. Obviously, we want players getting a ton of air yards because that means their yardage upside is massive if they hit, but it's fine if they're not amongst the league leaders in that category as long as their targets are high value in another way. For instance, maybe they have targets near the end zone, which have a high scoring probability. So we'll take a look at some players who underperformed in week 1, or maybe players that I expect their role to expand in the coming weeks. Before we do that, though, have to do the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat was Christian McCaffrey, Saquon Barkley, David Johnson, and Ezekiel Elliott played the most receiving snaps among running backs. Who played the 5th most? The answer was Nyheim Hines, and Mario Garcia was the first one to get that one correct. Today's stat: there were 13 wide receivers with at least 100 receiving yards in week 1. Given their total volume, who had the fewest expected receiving yards? And now you're going to hear expected yards, expected fantasy points a lot in maybe today's video and future videos. Simply put, expected receiving yards is how many yards we would expect them to have given their volume. It's pretty simple. So given that a player saw 7 targets for X amount of air yards and those targets were on X positions on the field, how many receiving yards should they have had on average if we were to simulate this game 1,000,000 times? And it's the same for expected fantasy points as well. Given their exact volume, how many fantasy points should we expect them to have on average? This is key for trading because if a player is getting a ton of looks and those targets are coming deep downfield and in the red zone, but they're underperforming in fantasy, well, we want to trade for them because they're honestly just getting a little bit unlucky. So who underperformed this week? First up, we have DJ Moore. Moore led the Panthers in both percent of team air yards and total targets, commanding 37% of the air yards and 9 targets, but was only able to convert that into 4 receptions for 54 yards and 0 touchdowns, while ranking 3rd among wide receivers in fantasy points below expectation. I think people are going to panic seeing him post a pretty mediocre stat line in week 1, but there's no need for that. I'm actually a little bit encouraged after Sunday. We had an ADOT of 11.5, which is comparable to guys like T.Y. Hilton, Odell, Mike Evans, Diggs, Gallup, and the one big concern heading into the season was, Bridgewater's ADOT. Was he going to throw the ball downfield? Well, Bridgewater ranked 15th in average air yards per pass attempt, and he was ahead of guys like Dak Prescott, Daniel Jones, Big Ben, Kyler Murray, Russell Wilson, even Patrick Mahomes. So I'm encouraged about this new Panthers offense. They put up 30 points, and honestly, their defense was as bad as we thought it would be. So they're going to be down a lot. They're going to have teams score a lot of points on them. They're going to need to catch up, and they're just never going to be able to run the clock out. And that's going to be good for the total pass attempts, and that's going to be good for the needed aggressiveness of this offense, and that's going to benefit DJ Moore, who is their top receiver. So I would be trading for DJ Moore. Another player who underperformed is Allen Robinson. Robinson ranked 5th among wide receivers in fantasy points below expectation, commanding 9 targets, including 3 red zone targets, one of which came in the end zone, and then 38% of the Bears' air yards, while posting one of the deepest ADOTs among all wide receivers. Yet, after all of this, he combined for only 5 receptions for 74 yards, which isn't horrible. I'm not saying he had a bad game. 5 for 74 is pretty solid. But on average, it should have been much better, and I think it will be going forward. This coming week, he faces a Giants defense that didn't put up all that much resistance against the Steelers' passing attack, and it's one that Robinson did torch for 131 yards and a touchdown last season. So I'd be looking to trade for Robinson before Sunday, and I value both these guys, talking about Robinson and Moore, as low-end wide receiver ones. I think that's the value you're going to have to give up to get them. On the lower end of the spectrum, and a player that might actually be on free agency in a lot of leagues, but that I definitely wanted to talk about, is Henry Ruggs. Now, Ruggs currently leads the NFL in percent of team air yards, commanding just a jaw-dropping 60.5% of the Raiders' air yards, even though he just had 5 total targets. His 18.5 air yards per target ranks 5th among all wide receivers, which is terrifying because he also ranks 8th in yards after the catch per reception and 6th in expected yak per reception. So it didn't just come on one random missed tackle. So almost no one is seeing targets deeper downfield than Henry Ruggs, and fewer people gain more yards after the catch than Ruggs. That is a lethal combination, and it's even more exciting when you consider the game script, right? Because this was one of the few games that we expect the Raiders to have a lead for the majority of the game. The Raiders are going to win football games, right? They're not a horrible team, but they're not, the Chiefs. They're not the Seahawks. They're not the Packers, right? This is a good team, but not one that we expect to be leading in the majority of games. The most common game script for the Raiders is going to be that the game is close or that they're trailing by a little bit. And that means they're not going to be able to run Josh Jacobs 30 times a game, right? They're going to be trailing. And so when we have a player, like I said, that is seeing targets as deep as anyone downfield, and on those targets, he also has run after the catch greater than most players, and he's on a team that's going to be trailing or at least close in a lot of games, that's terrifying. That has so much upside. And then you consider, they also gave him 2 carries. They're going to do that a ton, so he has a rushing upside as well. Rookies usually don't break out until the second half of the season, but I am very excited about what I saw from Henry Ruggs in this offense in week 1, and so I'm just pumped about his prospect moving forward. If he's on free agency in your league, I think you got to add him, and if not, I would try to trade for him, especially because I don't think the asking price is going to be all that high, so you should be able to get him for just like a bench player or two, and honestly, I think that's a smart thing to do. Next up, we've got a second-year receiver, and that's Diontae Johnson. Didn't look like it was going to be a good game from the start, right? I mean, he had just a horrible start to the game. There was the fumble. There was that one weird play where it looked like it was going to be a wide receiver screen, and I don't know who between Juju, Diontae Johnson, and Big Ben screwed up, but the most likely scenario is that Diontae Johnson was the one that screwed up because both Juju and Diontae were blocking, and then Big Ben just threw it to Diontae Johnson, who just wasn't looking. Clearly, it was probably going to him on the screenplay. So he should have had that reception. He should have had more yards. But regardless, he commanded 29% of the Steelers' air yards and 10 targets. Both of those led the team. So he had the most air yards on the team, the most targets on the team, and in fact, there were only 10 wide receivers in the entire NFL last week that had at least 10 targets, and he was one of just 3 of them to not have at least 110 receiving yards. He only gained 6 receptions for 57 yards. And anyone who watched our videos over the summer knows that we love his talent, and I love the Steelers as a bounce-back offense this year. But even I was a little bit surprised with the target disparity between Juju and Diontae Johnson. We knew Johnson was going to play on the outside, allowing Juju to play in the slot where he's more comfortable, but I really thought Juju would still lead the team in targets. Now remember, it's week 1. He still can't. We've seen 4 quarters of football from the Steelers. But I'm very encouraged with Johnson's involvement after 1 week, and I think he's going to have a very productive season. So I'd be looking to trade him for roughly flex value because I really think he's going to be an asset to your team. The final player we'll go over today is actually 2 players, and that's both Julian Edelman and N'Keal Harry. This might come as a shock, but Edelman currently ranks 3rd in percent of team air yards among all wide receivers. I think among all players, actually. No, he is among all players. And he's behind only Henry Ruggs and DK Metcalf. You don't usually think of that, right? Ruggs is a deep threat. Metcalf's a deep threat. Edelman, like 59% or 58% of the Patriots' air yards. People were worried about Newton being inaccurate this season. He completed 79% of his targets, so I think we can throw that out the window, including 5 of 6 to Edelman. You might see 7 on some sites, but one was a throwaway, so it doesn't count. If you look at PFF, they throw away throwaways, but he caught 5 of 6 targets. And then Newton threw 5 of 5 targets completed to N'Keal Harry. So he was pretty accurate. And the exciting thing about this was Harry didn't get that touchdown. Stinks for Patriots fans, stinks for Harry. But for fantasy, if he had scored that touchdown, remember he got tackled at like the 1 and then he fumbled into the end zone. Let's say he scores that touchdown, his price is going up. So he only had 5 receptions for very few yards, doesn't get the touchdown. He's going to be extremely cheap. Wouldn't be shocked if he's on free agency in a lot of leagues. Talking about N'Keal Harry, obviously, not Julian Edelman. But both of these guys are just the entire receiving game. They were the only 2 wide receivers to get a single target. And then the only other players on the Patriots to get a target were 3 for James White, then 1 for Ryan Izzo, and 1 for J.J. Taylor. I mean, think about that. The majority of all targets went to just 2 wide receivers, and this was in a game against the Dolphins, right? They were winning for basically the entire game, if not the entire game, and they were able to run the ball 67% of the time. Well, that's not going to continue most weeks, right? The Patriots are still good, but they're not as good as they used to be. And so there are going to be more games where it's much closer and more games where they're trailing that they're not going to be able to run the ball 2/3 of the time, right? And so when that happens, if they're still hitting, they're not going to hit 80% of targets. But if Newton is still staying relatively accurate and he's still basically only throwing to N'Keal Harry and Julian Edelman, their target upside is massive. And so I would be looking to trade wide receiver 2 value for Julian Edelman. And then honestly, you can get N'Keal Harry for bench value, which I think is a steal. So those are the wide receivers I'd be looking to trade for the most after week 2. If you want to see my complete list of players I'd be trading for, including my number 1 wide receiver buy low, then you can check that out at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. But that's the end of this one. Hope you all did enjoy. If you did, how about hitting that like button? And how about subscribing to the channel if you're new? Thanks for watching.